This is Dominissimo Voxlore, transmitting on channels woven through the webway itself. In this broadcast, we chart the rise and fall of the Aeldari, the ancient masters of the galaxy, whose empire of splendour birthed the god of ruin. This is no simple tale of triumph or tragedy. It is the saga of people divided, the disciplined craftworlders walking the paths of restraint, the savage Drukhari who feast on suffering in the dark city, the Exodites who endure upon their maiden worlds, the Corsairs who burn with reckless freedom, and the Ynnari who dare to whisper of salvation in death. Strike the seal of subscription, or be lost among the dead whose souls were devoured. Steel your will, guard your spirit, and bear witness to this decree. This is the voice of Dominissimo, and this is the lore of the Aeldari. The story of the Aeldari begins in an age beyond memory, in a time when the galaxy was young and the stars themselves were still coming to birth. Long before the Imperium of Man, before the myriad of Xenos races, and even before the full flowering of the warp as known in the 41st millennium, existed a race older still, the Old Ones. These beings, mysterious and powerful, shaped the fate of innumerable species. Of these, the Aeldari, often known simply as Eldar, were among their most poignant creations, or perhaps their greatest legacy. The Old Ones created the Eldar, nurturing their psychic potential and guiding them to serve as instruments in the Old Ones' war against cosmic threats. Foremost among them, the Necrons and their masters, the C'tan. The Old Ones entrusted the Eldar with tools of unimaginable sophistication, mastery of the webway, warp-sensitive psychic abilities, and technologies that intertwined artistry with power. With these gifts, the Eldar flourished. Their empire, known as the Eldar Empire or Dominion, came to dominate the galaxy. It stretched across a vast number of worlds, many dazzling in beauty and steeped in culture. Worlds such as Croesus, Lildris, Mimira, and the worlds near that would later become the Eye of Terror were jewels of art, civilization, and psychic resonance. They were not merely physical dominions, they were realms of elevated consciousness. Every Eldar was innately psychic, and society operated in ways alien to human minds. Lifespans were long, often many thousands of Terran years. Society freed itself, to a large extent, from the need of labour and toil. Industry was transformed into elaboration, infrastructure shaped by beauty, not utility. The webway carried not only trade and communication, but cultural expression itself. Though this empire was supreme, it was not uniform. The Eldar excelled in all forms of endeavour, in art, in philosophy, in spirituality, in psychic craft. Their society was steeped in ritual, and myth played a vital role. Harlequin troops preserved ancient stories in dance. Seers and sages debated the nature of the warp. Scholars catalogued the Old Ones' teachings wherever possible. Yet even at the height of their greatness, there were whispers, warnings from a few far-sighted Eldar and echoes of prophecy from the Old Ones themselves, that this radiant age carried a fatal flaw. Power piled upon power. Over time, the Eldar grew not just aware of their supremacy, but enamoured with it. The physical needs of their civilization were handled by machines, by physics, by constructs beyond human imagining. Labour, hardship, want, all were distant memories. This post-scarcity utopia, however, came at a cost. The Eldar mind, gifted with intensity, began to pursue sensation, novelty, pleasure. Where once purpose came from knowledge or duty, it began to be found in indulgence. Visionary Eldar foresaw this drift. They saw how the webway, psychic resonance, and warp sensitivity could become vulnerabilities if misused or left unchecked. But their voices were softened by harmony, drowned by the growing cacophony of luxury and excess. Meanwhile, the Eldar held sway over most of known space. Rival races were tolerated or patronised. Some were in league or treaty, others conquered or subdued, but none could truly rival Eldar might. Even in matters of war, the Eldar often delegating physical conflicts to constructs, to psychic dominions, or to remote theatres, because the Empire's strength was such that threats seemed distant reflections of beauty rather than true dangers. Empires rise, but the greatest empires are those that believe nothing can threaten their perfection, and the Eldar believed it. As the Eldar Empire stretched its influence, its reach extended into the fabric of reality itself via the webway. This labyrinth network of pathways through the warp, constructed and perfected with the Old One's lore, allowed near instantaneous travel, protected from many of the dangers that warp travel in real space would bring. For the Eldar, the webway was both lifeline and canvas, allowing them to weave together trade, politics, worship, and exploration across the stars. Worlds blossomed, art, science, spirituality intertwined. It seemed an empire eternal. But in the shadows of the eternal radiance, cracks were forming. The very gifts that made the Eldar supreme, their heightened emotions, their psychic prowess, their unbounded freedom, would be the tools of their undoing. The seeds of their fall, the first whispers of collapse, floated in the margins. Some Eldar who recalled at the growing decadence, others who fled to pristine worlds far from the core, seeking solace or purity, yet still others who dedicated themselves to asceticism or to preserving memory. In this moment, at the height of beauty, power and pride, the stage was set, not for victory, but for downfall. In the height of their splendour, the Eldar Empire was more than a galactic power. It was a culture built upon perfection. Their cities were art, their machines poetry, and their minds capable of weaving psychic webs that connected, but also magnified every sensation. This finely honed sensibility, which made the Eldar unique, also made them vulnerable. The emotional and psychic faculties they prized so highly did not dull with time. Instead, they sharpened, becoming more intense, more demanding. As centuries passed, the Eldar no longer needed labour or toil. Automated machines handled every task. The raw edges of life, hunger, hardship, danger, were largely erased. In their place grew a hunger for experience. Ordinary pleasure became insufficient. Sensation became the goal. To feel more, to see more, to know more. Even to feel pain or terror as intensely as joy. It was in this restless hunger that pleasure cults arose. Groups dedicated to particular extremes of feeling, sensation, suffering, ecstasy. These cults were at first niche. Artists, psychics, philosophers exploring the outer boundaries of emotion. But with time, what was experimental became mainstream. What was taboo grew to be celebrated. Terrible rituals that toyed with pain and violence became art forms. Murder, torture, decadent excess, all took shape under gilded facades and in secret halls. What began as aesthetic or philosophical exploration descended into personal deification. Individuals seeking to push themselves, to become legends, to leave marks so great that the gods themselves might notice. Amid this spiral, many Eldar felt fear. Not the immediate fear of invaders or cosmic catastrophe, but a deeper cosmic dread. That these excesses were feeding something in the warp, something dark, growing stronger with every scream, every cry, every ecstasy. Seers and prophet kings tried to warn others. Some spoke of prophecy of birth pangs, of an unborn being in the immaterium born of their own sins. But the culture, drunk on sensation, was not ready to heed the warnings, for to listen meant to admit guilt, and most refused. Some Eldar could not abide the decay. These were the far-sighted dissidents, the religious, the ascetic, the spiritual, and those haunted by dreams of impending doom. These dissenters began to isolate themselves, to reject the rising madness. They built paths of restraint, of silence, prayer, service, but even that proved insufficient in many homeworlds. Corruption seeped through the walls, through art, through music, through every psychic echo. Many of these dissidents became known as prophets or madmen, depending on who listened. Eventually, these dissidents did one of the hardest things. They fled. They left behind gilded spires, great cities, all the indulgences and artifice. They fled toward the edges of the galaxy to settle what would later be called Maiden Worlds. These exiles became known as Exodites. They deliberately abandoned advanced automata, eschewed convenience, embraced a physically demanding, austere life. They tilled the soil, raised animals, built small communities. They shunned what the rest of the Eldar had come to worship, luxury and excess, in favour of what their soul required, purpose, spiritual integrity and awareness. These Exodite worlds were not paradises. They were hard. Many were wild. Some had savage beasts, deadly predators, harsh climates. Life demanded struggle, yet for the Exodites, this struggle was precisely the point. Each day's labour, each wound and hardship was a reminder of what had been lost, and what must be preserved. They cultivated traditions quite unlike those of their decadent kin. They used simpler tools. They lived in tribal communities led by dragon lords and chiefs. They built small shrines and used stone circles, psychoactive crystal relics, to anchor their spirits and protect their souls, even in death. Their dead became part of a world spirit, an echo of Eldar infinity circuits, but rooted in land, struggle, and honest sacrifice. The Exodite migration, this exodus, did not happen overnight. It was the gradual accumulation of disgust, fear, and prophetic vision. Some left quietly, shipping plants, animals, lore, families. Others fled in dread, screaming dreams they could not shake. Many died in transit, either from exposure to psychic shocks, from the perils of travel, or from raiders. But enough survived, and their worlds became strongholds of resistance against the coming collapse. Meanwhile, on the core worlds, decadence ran rampant. Pleasure cults competed to outdo one another. Artisans sculpted horror as beauty. The laws that had once kept excess at the margins loosened. Government bureaucracy had born of beauty, and it broke under its own weight. Religious rites and shrines decayed. Pantheons of gods once beloved were either abandoned or turned into grotesque parodies of themselves. Where once there had been honour or duty, there was only sensation, moment-to-moment ecstasy or cruelty, and an endless chase for the next peak of experience. Still, even as corruption grew, there existed those who remained loyal to the ancient ways. The Harlequins among them. They preserved myths, performed dance and drama pieces that remembered the old ones. They told stories of restraint, of sacrifice, of sorrow and restraint. They served as living memory of what had once been, an echo of elegy. Their performances were warnings, but against the roar of lust and cruelty, they were little more than murmurs. By the end of this chapter of history, the Eldar Empire faced a bifurcation. On one side lay decay and destiny tied together, on the other side, exile and endurance. The Exodites would survive, yes, but in a way that would forever set them apart. The Eldar left behind would continue until the final moment of catastrophe, unaware that the warp's chaos steadily coiled around their souls, awaiting the act that would birth a god of excess and rend their golden empire apart. In the twilight of the Eldar Empire, when its brilliance had reached its zenith, an undercurrent of dread began to stir, both in the warp and in the hearts of the Eldar themselves. It was a time when the unrestrained appetites of a civilization had become more than culture. They had become a psychic force, something dangerous, something alive. It started with the immense psychic backlash of indulgence. As the Eldar's capacity for sensation and emotion grew, so too did their psychic echo. Every act of excess, every scream, every cry of ecstasy or anguish, even those things once kept hidden in private halls, created ripples in the immaterium. Pleasure cults, once obscure and marginal, now clamoured openly for new thrills. Depravity that had once been unthinkable became daily spectacle. The Eldar's souls, unnaturally tuned, poured more of themselves into the warp with each passing generation. Their collective emotional resonance, once an asset of their greatness, was forming something else, something malevolent. This psychic leakage did not remain static. Within the warp, premonitions of a stirring chaos god appeared, whispers in psychic dreams, portents interpreted in rites. Some seers claimed to see an unborn entity, an echo of terror and ecstasy woven together, and fed by the very beings it emerged from. But these warnings, though they startled some, were brushed aside by many. To acknowledge them was to acknowledge guilt, and to admit that no amount of beauty or creation could atone for the void forming at the edges of their souls. Then came the moment of birth. In the early 30th millennium, everything changed. The entity, born from the Eldar's unchecked indulgence, reached sentience in the warp. This was not a gradual creep but a sudden shattering blow. Amongst psychic screams, that newborn god cried out, its voice not just a sound, but a psychic explosion felt across vast distances. The very warp trembled. In that instant, trillions of Eldar, living on their magnificent worlds, in their palaces and plazas of their glory, felt the birth throes. Souls were ripped from bodies. The psychic shockwave consumed the immaterial lifeblood of the Eldar. Many Craftworlds far from the core felt deja vu, madness, grief, the sense that all their restraint might be in vain. Real space too was torn open. The psychic implosion at the heart of the Eldar Empire created a rupture, a wound in reality now called the Eye of Terror. Worlds around this epicenter were destroyed instantly. Cities that had stood for millennia collapsed, their spires broken, their people vaporized or consumed. The vacuum of suffering and ecstasy turned into something horrifying, when souls, on the brink, were drawn into the warp and devoured. The tide of death was so great that even Eldar who had isolated themselves, who believed themselves safe, could not fully shield their souls. Millions more died. Among the gods of the Eldar, only a few remained to oppose this birth. Pantheons that had guided the race through creation, art, war, and life were diminished, consumed or destroyed in the turmoil. Ancient deities like Aeldari, Isha, Lilith fell. Cain, the god of war, rose to fight, but even he was shattered. Though not entirely destroyed, his essence was dispersed, transformed, broken into avatars that remained in the mortal realm. The laughing god, Commorragh, evaded death by hiding in the webway, becoming a trickster, a survivor of divine attrition. Yet the tragedy was not simply one of gods. Every living Eldar who lacked strong protections, spirit stones, the infrastructure of infinity circuits, found their souls at risk. When they died, their souls became prey. The newborn god, Slaanesh, she who thirsts, hungry and insatiable, reached for those souls not yet consumed. Even in death, the Eldar could not escape. The Craftworlders, who tried to retreat and preserve themselves, found sometimes even their remoteness offered no solace. Meanwhile, among the stars, the survivors recoiled. The surviving Craftworlds fled. The Exodites, living far beyond the core with minimal psychic interference, escaped with much fewer losses, but they felt the shock too. Their worlds, though remote, trembled with grief and loss. Many of their kind realised that what they had fled was not just physical destruction, it was the end of everything they had believed was eternal: culture, artifice, divine majesty. And in Commorragh, in the webway, the fringe elements, those devoted to excess, watched. The birth of Slaanesh did not annihilate them all. Some were already so twisted by their own depravity that the god could claim their souls even while they lived. Others sought opportunity, a chance to hold the knife edge of survival by feeding the god's hunger in others. And so the Drukhari, in their cruelty and sadism, became a living reminder of what had come before, and still what stands at risk. When the storm cleared, the Aeldari Empire was no more. Trillions were gone, the great gods were dead or shattered, countless worlds were lost. What remained was scattered, Craftworlds adrift in the void of space, Exodite worlds clinging to the soil, those in the webway hiding from the echoes of the fall. The noble paths, the high arts, the pride of civilization, rendered fragile, relics in a universe grown darker. The arrogance that had once elevated them had become their undoing. But even as the Eldar wept, even as the tapestry of their former glory lay in ruins, there remained a breath in the wreckage. Surviving Craftworlds carried the infinity circuits. The Harlequins preserved myth and memory. The few gods that remained, like Commorragh, fled to shadows. But their survival was proof, perhaps even in ruin, something could be saved. Not glory, not dominion, but survival. Thus, the fall of the Eldar stands as the darkest hour of their long history, a catastrophe born not from an enemy siege or cosmic invasion, but from within, a civilization's greatness undone by its own perfections. And yet, from that ruin, new strands of hope would later emerge. The roads ahead would be strewn with sorrow, but the Eldar, Craftworld, Exodite, and Drukhari alike, would learn that survival demands sacrifice, restraint, and courage born of remorse. The fall had come like a thunderclap, annihilating in a heartbeat what seemed eternal. The core of the Aeldari Empire was gone, swallowed by the birth of Slaanesh, and the Eye of Terror yawned open as its tomb. Yet across the galaxy, scattered embers of the once great civilization flickered. Some burned faintly, others fiercely, but all bore the burden of survival. Far from the decadent heart worlds, immense ark-like vessels drifted through the void. These were the Craftworlds, gargantuan world ships constructed in earlier centuries by the more cautious among the Eldar. Originally built as trading hubs, they had grown into self-sustaining sanctuaries, carrying entire populations, ecosystems, and cultures upon their wraithbone hulls. Their exodus had seemed eccentric at the time, paranoid even, when the Eldar Empire still basked in its dominion. But when the psychic scream of Slaanesh shattered the soul of their species, these wandering citadels became the cradles of survival. Within the Craftworlds, the survivors reeled at what had been lost. Families torn asunder, gods slain, worlds burned away into a warp storm so vast it reshaped the very map of the galaxy. For many, grief turned quickly to dread, for they realised the truth. Even in death, there was no release. The newborn god still haunted their souls, ever thirsting. What was once eternal life through reincarnation, the ability to return again and again in new flesh, was now shattered forever. If an Eldar died, their spirit risked being devoured, their essence trapped within Slaanesh's clutches for eternity. In answer to this horror, the Craftworlders turned to the Spirit Stone. These psycho-reactive crystals, carefully fashioned from wraithbone, could capture a soul at the moment of death. Once secured, the spirit would be transferred into the Craftworld's infinity circuit, a psychic matrix interwoven throughout the vessel. There, the dead could rest in communion, guiding and protecting the living and shielding themselves from the predator lurking in the warp. It was not reincarnation, it was not freedom, but it was sanctuary. Thus, the Craftworld Aeldari bound their fate to their ships, living symbiotically with their dead, carrying their ancestors within the very bones of their homes. Yet survival was more than technology, it demanded a complete restructuring of their way of life. Where once indulgence had reigned, now discipline became paramount. The Craftworlders instituted the Path system, a way of life built to restrain the extremes of the Eldar emotion. Each individual would devote themselves to a single discipline at a time, walking a path until they mastered it fully before moving on. The path of the warrior, the path of the seer, the path of the artisan, the path of the poet, all were roads to mastery, but also cages to contain the passions that once birthed their doom. By enforcing restraint, they sought to ensure that never again would their people's excess feed the horrors of the warp. While the Craftworlders forged order out of disaster, others had already chosen exile long before the fall. These were the Exodites, the far-sighted who had abandoned the Empire during its decadence, settled on remote maiden worlds. They had turned their backs on the hollow luxury of their kin. They lived hard lives of toil and danger, taming savage landscapes and warring with predators both natural and unnatural. To outsiders, their existence seemed primitive, a regression into tribalism. But for the Exodites, this hardship was purification. By grinding themselves in the soil, by living close to nature and far from temptation, they preserved the spiritual clarity denied to their fallen kin. Their dead merged into the world spirit of each planet, a gestalt psychic echo akin to the Infinity Circuit, binding them eternally to the land they bled to defend. Even further from the mainstream, another path emerged, the wandering raiders and Corsairs of the Void. Some Eldar, unwilling to submit to the rigid paths of the Craftworlds, yet too restless to live as Exodites, became outcasts. They roamed in fleets, striking as pirates, mercenaries, or explorers. Some were little better than marauders, indistinguishable from their Drukhari cousins in cruelty. Others walked a finer line, still clinging to shreds of ancient honour. These Corsairs embodied the dangerous freedom of the Eldar spirit, untamed, vibrant, but perpetually at risk of falling into the same excess that had destroyed their empire. And then there were the most tragic of survivors, the Eldar who had remained in the webway when the fall erupted. They were spared annihilation only because they dwelled within those hidden passageways, but the psychic shock of Slaanesh's birth reached even them. Many went mad, others survived only by embracing atrocity. From these outcasts arose the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar of Commorragh, a people who fed on the suffering of others to stave off the predation of she who thirsts. Their tale, though intertwined with that of the survivors, was one of horror and cruelty. For the Craftworlders and Exodites, they became a living reminder of everything that had been lost, and everything they had sworn never to become. Despite their fragmentation, the survivors were united by trauma. The fall was not just an apocalypse of flesh and fire, it was a psychic wound that lingered in every mind. No Eldar could meditate without sensing the distant hunger of Slaanesh. No seer could gaze into the future without glimpsing the shadow of their race's doom. The survivors were not simply rebuilding, they were living in the shadow of a cosmic predator that would never tire, never forgive, and never relent. Yet even in this despair, hope glimmered. The Craftworlds, though scattered, preserved fragments of the old empire's grandeur. The Exodites, though astir, preserved its soul. The Corsairs, though reckless, preserved its fire. And the Harlequins, enigmatic as ever, wandered between them all, keepers of myth and memory, emissaries of the laughing god, ensuring that even in ruin, the stories of the Eldar would endure. The Exodus was not a single event, but an ongoing journey. Each Craftworld drifted on its own course, isolated and independent. Some grew mighty, like the Ulthway, forever stationed near the Eye of Terror, its seers striving to forestall the doom they had foreseen. Others, like the Biltan, clung to dreams of restoring the Aeldari Empire, their warrior shrines always ready for battle. Still others, like Ynnead, sought solace in quiet and contemplation, only to face tragedies yet to come. The Exodites, meanwhile, remained hidden, their worlds forgotten by most of the galaxy, but their way of life ensured that even at the farthest edge, the Aeldari spirit endured. In the wake of annihilation, the survivors did not simply continue. They adapted, they restrained, they endured. The Eldar were no longer an empire, no longer rulers of the galaxy, but they were not extinct. Theirs was now a story of survival, fragile, desperate and haunted, yet unbroken. The Exodus was both exile and salvation. In fleeing the ruins of their own arrogance, the Aeldari carried with them not only the weight of their sins, but the spark of their identity. That spark, though faint, would one day kindle new fires fires of war, prophecy, and perhaps redemption. If the Craftworlds were sanctuaries and the Exodite worlds refugees, then Commorragh was something altogether darker. Born from survival, forged in cruelty, it became the heart of a civilization that turned the sins of the past into means of endurance. To the Drukhari, it was not simply a city. It was the nexus of their empire, a labyrinth nightmare hidden deep within the webway. Commorragh existed long before the fall. In the days of the Aeldari Empire, it was one of the many metropolises within the webway, a hub of trade, politics, and pleasure. Protected from the dangers of real space, it grew vast, fed by endless connections to other realms and by the wealth of a civilization at its zenith. Yet when the fall erupted, Commorragh did not perish like the core worlds. Its isolation within the webway spared it the psychic cataclysm. In that instant, what had once been merely one among many Eldar cities became the greatest surviving centre of their decadent empire. But survival was not immunity. The psychic birth of Slaanesh sent ripples through the webway. The citizens of Commorragh, already steeped in excess, discovered with horror that their very souls were being hunted. Many went mad, others wasted away. The newborn god's thirst was unrelenting, and even behind the barriers of the webway, they could not escape. It was here that the Drukhari found their terrible solution. They discovered by inflicting torments on others, by drawing out pain, fear and suffering, they could siphon a twisted form of life energy to sustain themselves. Each scream, each shudder of agony delayed the predator's grasp. The act of torture became not just sadism, but survival. In time, it became ritual, culture, even identity. To starve Slaanesh, they feasted upon others. Commorragh transformed. Once a jewel of the webway, it became a labyrinth of agony. Its streets twisted with towers of impossible design, pleasure palaces turned to arenas of slaughter, galleries into halls of torment. The city sprawled across hidden dimensions, expanding endlessly through tunnels, gates and fissures. Millions upon millions dwelt within, and every soul fed upon the misery of others. Slaves, human Xenos and fellow Eldar, were dragged into its depths. None left. Commorragh became known as the Dark City, and its inhabitants, the Drukhari, embraced cruelty as their defining truth. Ruling this nightmare was the Cabals. These powerful dynasties, led by Archons, carved out districts of Commorragh as their own. Each Archon ruled by fear and intrigue, commanding warriors, assassins and fleets of raiders that could pour into real space at a moment's notice. Alliances shifted constantly. Betrayal was an art form. In Commorragh, to trust was to invite death, for ambition was endless and mercy non-existent. Among these tyrants, one rose above all, Astrabael Vect. Once a low-born slave, Vect clawed his way to supremacy through cunning and ruthlessness. In the time after the fall, he orchestrated massacres, toppled rivals, and manipulated enemies into annihilating one another. His genius was not brute force, but manipulation. In one infamous act, he lured an entire cabal into unleashing a demon invasion, then sealed the portals and blamed them for treachery, destroying his enemies and elevating himself in a single stroke. With such gambits, he founded the Cabal of the Black Heart, the most powerful of all. Vect declared himself the supreme ruler of Commorragh, and though many Archons despised him, few dared challenge him openly. Under Vect's iron hand, Commorragh expanded its reach into real space. Raiding parties became the lifeblood of the Dark City. The Drukhari struck without warning, emerging from the webway to snatch entire populations from worlds across the galaxy. Whole cities vanished in the night, dragged screaming into Commorragh's arenas. To the Imperium, they became nightmares whispered in hushed tones. The shadows that stole children from their beds, the raiders who laughter echoed in the dark. And to the Drukhari, this was sustenance, each raid a harvest of souls that kept them from Slaanesh's embrace. Commorragh's culture grew more twisted with every generation. Gladiatorial arenas like those of Lelith Hesprax's witch cult drew countless spectators, their performances a blend of artistry and slaughter. The homunculi covens, ancient flesh sculptors, delved into grotesque experiments, reshaping bodies into weapons, torturing captives in ways that prolonged their agony indefinitely. Their creations, grotesques, racks, taloi, became nightmares unleashed upon real space. And yet to the Drukhari, this was not evil. It was life. In their eyes, the galaxy was prey, and they the apex predators. But the Dark City was not invincible. Slaanesh's thirst still loomed, ever hungering. To stave it off, the Drukhari could never relent. Every day required new suffering, every raid fresh victims. They were prisoners of their own solution, bound to a cycle of cruelty without end. Some whispered of other ways, of prophecies, of the god Ynnead, of salvation beyond torment, but such whispers were silenced quickly. Vect and the Archons ensured that Commorragh remained as it was, a crucible of pain, unchanging, eternal. The city itself reflected this paradox. It was magnificent in its grandeur, with spires of impossible architecture, glittering lights, and endless halls. But beneath its surface lay horror upon horror, a maze of dungeons and slaughterhouses, slave pits and laboratories. Beauty and atrocity intertwined so thoroughly that they were indistinguishable. Commorragh was both the pinnacle of survival and the embodiment of corruption. For the Craftworlders and Exodites, Commorragh became a symbol of their darkest fears. Where they sought discipline and purity, the Drukhari embraced indulgence and cruelty. Where they walked the paths of restraint, the Drukhari revelled in freedom without limits. They were kin, yet twisted mirrors of each other, proof that survival could take many forms, not all of them noble. And yet, for all this horror, Commorragh endured. It survived the fall, the millennia that followed, and even the great upheavals of the 41st millennium. In the shadows of the webway, it grew and thrived, feeding on the galaxy like a parasite that could never be excised. The Dark City was not simply a refuge of survivors, it was a defiance of extinction, a declaration that the Eldar would live on, even if it meant becoming monsters. Commorragh stood as both curse and crown, the last empire of indulgence, the eternal fortress of the damned, and the home of the people who had embraced the very sins that had once destroyed their race. In the darkness of its halls, amid the screams and laughter, the Drukhari whispered their creed: survival at any cost. Where Commorragh plunged into shadow, the Craftworld sought light through discipline. The survivors adrift in those great wraithbone vessels knew that if they carried on as their kin had done, if they surrendered again to indulgence and unbridled emotion, they would surely be lost to Slaanesh as well. Thus, the Asuryani, the people of the Craftworlds, remade their entire way of life. In the aftermath of the apocalypse, they chose not freedom, but structure, not indulgence, but restraint. The psychic wound of the fall was ever present. For every Eldar, the presence of she who thirsts was a constant shadow. At the moment of death, unless their souls were caught within the spirit stones and transferred into the ship's infinity circuit, they risked eternal torment. This fear was not abstract. It was felt in dreams, in whispers at the edge of meditation, in the chilling certainty that the predator in the warp was always watching. The Craftworlders could never live as they had before. Their very survival demanded a transformation of culture so profound that it reshaped every element of their existence. Thus was born the Path System. Eldar lives, once free and unrestrained, were now tightly woven into channels of discipline. Each Asuryani devoted themselves wholly to one path at a time. A discipline, vocation, or philosophy pursued until mastery was achieved. Then, and only then, could they step aside to walk another path. This was not simply career or education, it was spiritual armour. By pouring themselves fully into a single pursuit, their minds were shielded from dangerous distraction, from the temptations of indulgence that had destroyed their ancestors. There were countless paths, each reflecting a vital thread of Aeldari culture. The path of the artisan nurtured creativity through sculpture, song, and craft. The path of the poet refined language and emotion into controlled expression. The path of the seer demanded psychic discipline, training minds to interpret the schemes of fate while resisting the dangers of the warp. But most iconic was the path of the warrior, a discipline that produced the mighty aspect warriors who defended the Craftworld from external threats. The path of the warrior was perhaps the most dangerous of all. For the Eldar who turned their focus to combat, the intensity of battle could become intoxicating. To prevent warriors from losing themselves in bloodlust, each martial tradition was embodied by an aspect shrine, a temple dedicated to one facet of the war god Cain. Within these shrines, the Asuryani donned their war masks, both literal helms and psychic disciplines, that allowed them to embody a fragment of Kayla Mencha Cain's wrath without losing themselves completely. Each shrine produced a distinct warrior: the swift howling banshees, the stoic dark reapers, the versatile dire avengers, the stealthy striking scorpions, the airborne swooping hawks, and others besides. Every aspect embodied discipline and focus, not indulgence. Yet for some, the taste of war was too compelling. Those who could not set aside the path of the warrior, who became lost in endless cycles of combat, were said to be trapped as exarchs. They served as internal masters of their shrines, living embodiments of their aspect, but also tragic reminders of how easily passion could consume an Eldar soul. Where warriors embodied wrath, the farces and warlocks of the Path of the Seer embodied foresight. Psychic discipline was central to Craftworld survival, for seers could glimpse the possible futures that lay before their people. Eldrad Ulthran of the Ulthway, perhaps the most famous of all farseers, dedicated his life to weaving subtle interventions across the galaxy, manipulating the course of human and Xenos history alike to preserve a fragile chance of survival for the Asuryani. Yet even for farseers, discipline was crucial. A single misstep in the Immaterium, a single temptation of power, could lead to madness, or worse, to enslavement by demons. The paths were more than a social order, they were cultural identity. Every Asuryani grew up knowing they could walk many paths in their lifetime. One might begin on the path of the artisan, shaping Wraithbone into works of elegance, then move to the path of the warrior, donning the mask of a dire avenger, then to the path of the seer, guiding others with wisdom. This cycle proved both balance and stability, ensuring that no one passion grew unchecked, no desire overwhelmed the mind. The path system was salvation through structure. The Craftworlds themselves became reflections of this new way of life. Entirely self-contained, they were vast enough to host cities, forests, rivers, and seas within their Wraithbone hulls. The Infinity Circuit hummed at their core, a psychic reservoir where the dead dwelled, offering guidance to the living. Some Craftworlds became known for specific traditions. Ulthway, stationed perilously close to the Eye of Terror, emphasised psychic training, producing vast numbers of warlocks and farseers. Biltan was militant, its warrior shrines numerous, its philosophy fixated on restoring the lost empire of the Aeldari but through conquest. Ynnead, more reclusive, turned increasingly toward necrotechnology, summoning their dead from the Infinity Circuit to fight within ghostly wraith constructs. Each Craftworld was a nation unto itself, yet united by the shared burden of survival. It is important to note that this system was not merely imposed, it was embraced. The Fall had seared into every Asuryani's memory the cost of indulgence. To walk the path was to ensure survival, to honour the dead, and to protect future generations. Though some lamented their rigidity, few dared question its necessity. The alternative, chaos, excess, and damnation, was unthinkable. Yet for all their restraint, the Asuryani were not immune to tragedy. Their numbers dwindled with every passing millennium. Each death was permanent, for reincarnation was gone, and every soul lost to Slaanesh was an internal wound. Every battle fought, every raid survived, every new generation born was precious. Thus, the Craftworlds became both fortress and monasteries, floating testaments to the endurance of a people who refused to vanish, even as extinction loomed. The Asuryani paths were not merely ways of life, they were a philosophy of survival, a conscious choice to redefine what it meant to be Eldar. Where once their empire had revelled in excess, now they embraced discipline. Where once freedom had led to damnation, now restraint offered salvation. Theirs was a harder, narrower road, but one that, for all its sorrow, kept the flame of their people alive. And so, amid the cold stars and the endless darkness, the Craftworld Eldar walked their paths. Warriors, seers, artisans, poets. Each step an act of defiance against oblivion, each life a refusal to surrender to the thirsting god that hunted them still. For millennia after the fall, the scattered Aeldari walked their fragile roads of survival. The Craftworlds sailed on, the Exodites endured their harsh worlds, and Commorragh feasted in shadow. Yet in the 41st millennium, a new calamity split the galaxy apart. A catastrophe so vast that even the Asuryani, the Drukhari, and all the scattered kin of the Eldar could not escape its touch. The galaxy itself tore open, and the screams of the warp echoed through every star system. The Aeldari called it disjunction. The Imperium called it the Great Rift. To mortals, it was simply the end of the galaxy as it had been known. The Great Rift was born from disaster. In the closing years of M41, the psychic beacon of the Emperor faltered, and the galaxy's delicate balance tipped into chaos. Across the stars, a wound was ripped open in real space, a galactic scar from one side of the Milky Way to the other. This was the Cicatrix Maledictum, a chasm of unreality through which demons poured freely into the material realm. To humanity, it was an apocalypse. To the Aeldari, it was a grim reminder of their own ancient fall, replayed on a galactic scale. The psychic shock of the rift's opening did not confine itself to real space. The webway itself, that labyrinth of hidden passageways where Commorragh and countless enclaves lay, buckled beneath the strain. Corridors ruptured, gates collapsed, and demons surged through breaches long sealed. For the Aeldari, who relied on the webway for travel and survival, the disjunction was a calamity without precedent since the birth of Slaanesh. In Commorragh, the Dark City trembled. The great cabals, witch cults and homunculi covens that had long thought themselves secure behind the walls of the webway suddenly found their fortress was invaded by demonic hosts. Entire districts were overrun. Horrors stalked the streets, tearing down spires that had stood for 10 millennia. It was in this firestorm that even the Archons, for all their cruelty, felt fear. Some whispered that Commorragh itself might fall, its endless cycle of torment consumed not by its own decadence, but by the predators of the warp. The most infamous of these clashes was the Battle of Cain's Gate. At this unstable webway nexus, a breach yawned wide, threatening to pour demonic armies directly into the heart of the Dark City. Desperate cabals threw their warriors into the meat grinder, witches fought demons in gladiatorial combat for survival rather than sport, and the twisted creations of the homunculi were unleashed in droves. The fighting raged across nightmare battlefields of shifting wraithbone and shattered dimensions. For once, cruelty was not a choice but a necessity. Only through blood and sacrifice did the Drukhari stem the tide, sealing the breach at last. Yet the scars it left, both physical and psychic, remained. Commorragh was shaken, and though it endured, it had been reminded that even its hidden fortresses were not beyond the reach of catastrophe. The Craftworlds too felt the rift's bite. Ulthwé, stationed for countless millennia near the Eye of Terror, was buffeted by the psychic storm. Even its seasoned seers, long used to staring into the abyss, reeled as the immaterium erupted around them. Visions multiplied, futures splintered into countless skeins of disaster, and the Farseers strained to keep their people from despair. Ynnead, still reeling from its wars against the Tyranids, saw new breaches open in its portal routes, forcing its ghost warriors into yet more endless battle. Biel Tan, already fractured by internal strife and Yvain's rise among the Ynnead, found its martial further both tested and inflamed as warbands launched desperate counterattacks to preserve what remained of their path. For the Exodites, scattered as they were on the edges of the galaxy, the rift was no less dire. Warp storms raged across their skies. Demons descended upon their maiden worlds, slaughtering entire settlements in a night. Yet the Exodites, bound as they were to their land and their world spirits, resisted with the ferocity of those who had nothing left to lose. Mounted upon dragon-like megafauna, armed with ancient weapons, they fought not for empire or glory, but for the soil beneath their feet. In their struggles, they became a living echo of the Old One's wars against the Necrons, fragile mortals holding the line against gods and monsters. And through it all, Slaanesh laughed, for the Great Rift was more than just a wound in real space, it was a feast. The souls of the dying poured into the warp in incountable numbers, feeding all the Chaos Gods but none so hungrily as she who thirsts. For the Aeldari, this was agony, a reminder that their doom was not just in the past, but still very much alive. Every death risked becoming one more morsel for their eternal predator. Yet amid this storm, new currents stirred. The Ynnari, born from the whispers of Ynnead, gained strength. Many Aeldari saw in the disjunction a sign that their only hope lay not in paths or cruelty, but in the awakening of the god of the dead. Yvain and her followers journeyed across Craftworlds, Corsair fleets, and even into Commorragh itself, gathering souls to their cause. Where the rift had shattered unity, the Ynnari sought to weave it anew. Their message was radical. Only through death could the Aeldari be reborn. To some, this was blasphemy. To others, salvation. The disjunction, then, was not simply a disaster. It was a crucible. It tested every fragment of the Aeldari people. The Craftworlds endured through discipline, the Exodites through sacrifice, the Drukhari through cruelty, and the Ynnari through faith in a new god. The rift had split the galaxy in two, but it had also forced the Eldar to confront, once again, the truth that they could never escape. Their survival was never guaranteed, and their extinction was always just a breath away. The great warp storms had come and gone, but the scars remained. For the Asuryani, the lessons were clear. Even the most disciplined paths could not shield them from the galaxy's upheaval. For the Drukhari, the terror was sharper still. Commorragh was not untouchable. And for the Aeldari, one truth echoed louder than ever. The doom of their race was still unfolding, and whether by restraint, cruelty or prophecy, only the boldest of choices could decide their fate. From the ashes of the Fall and the storms of the Great Rift, a new voice arose among the Aeldari. For millennia, their existence had been marked by sorrow, survival and decline. They had walked the path to restraint, or embraced cruelty in the shadows of the webway, or hidden in exile on distant worlds. Yet always, the spectre of she who thirsts lingered above them. No matter the discipline of the Craftworlds or the sadism of the Drukhari, Slaanesh's hunger was unrelenting. But in the 41st millennium, a new possibility took shape. A god not of indulgence, nor war, nor trickery, but of death itself. The whispers of Ynnead, the slumbering god of the dead, heralded what the Aeldari began to call salvation. The idea of Ynnead was not new. Farseers and mystics had spoken for millennia of a god who would one day arise from the collected souls of the Aeldari, a god powerful enough to destroy Slaanesh. In myth, Ynnead was to be the last of their pantheon, born from the dead to avenge the living. But prophecy is often little more than hope clutched in despair. For generations, the Aeldari doubted it would ever come to pass. Yet when the galaxy split under the shadow of the Cicatrix Maledictum, when demons poured forth and disjunction ripped apart the webway, whispers became reality. The spark came upon Bil-Tan, the militant Craftworld whose dream of restoring the Aeldari dominion had long fueled its people's fervour. There, in the chaos of rebellion and ritual, a figure rose from obscurity. Yvain, once a gladiatrix of the witch cults of Commorragh, now reborn as a prophet. She had died in an arena, slain in spectacle, only to rise again moments later infused with a power that was not her own. Her resurrection was not the work of sorcery or homunculi alchemy, it was the touch of Ynnead, the god whose birth cry had stirred within her. With Yvain came her companions. The Vizarch, her mysterious champion, was a warrior of impeccable skill, said to have been an exile before abandoning his shrine. He became her sword and protector, a silent figure embodying both duty and tragedy. And most awe-inspiring of all was Incarn, the avatar of Ynnead itself. Manifesting wherever death was strongest, the Incarn appeared as a being of shifting flesh and bone, its voice a choir of the dead, its presence both terror and hope. To the Asuryani, it was the first tangible sign that Ynnead truly existed. To the Drukhari, it was a dangerous heresy that threatened the foundations of their cruel society. Yvain declared a new path, the Ynnari, those who dedicate themselves to awakening Ynnead fully and delivering the Aeldari from the grip of Slaanesh. Her message spread swiftly, carried not only by words but by miracles. Wherever she walked, the dead stirred. Wounded warriors found strength renewed. Whole cadres of aspect warriors slain in battle rose again in spectral unity, their spirits burning with the fire of Ynnead. These wonders inspired awe and fear alike. To some, Yvain was salvation incarnate. To others, she was a witch playing with powers that would doom them all. The Craftworlds split in their responses. Bil-Tan, already fractious, erupted into civil war between those who embraced the Ynnari and those who clung to the traditional paths. This conflict shattered the Craftworld itself, breaking its wraithbone core and scattering its fragments across space. Though Bil-Tan survived in a diminished state, the event marked Ynnari's first great triumph, and their first great tragedy. Ulthwé, wary but pragmatic, lent support to Yvain's cause through Eldrad Ulthran, who saw in Ynnead the only possible path to his people's survival. Other Craftworlds remained distant, fearful of abandoning millennia of discipline for an untested god. The Drukhari reacted with fury. Commorragh was thrown into upheaval as Yvain's presence spread whispers of rebellion. Many of the lowborn, weary of endless torment, flocked to her banner, seeing in her a release from their endless cycle of cruelty and fear. To Archons and Homunculi, however, she was a direct threat. If the souls of the Drukhari no longer required the sustenance of suffering, their entire society would collapse. Yvain became the target of assassination after assassination, each attempt ending in failure as the Vizarch's blade or the Incarn's wrath cut down her foes. Despite opposition, the Ynnari grew. They became a wandering host, drawing from every fragment of the Aeldari race. Craftworlders walked beside Corsairs, Exodites beside former Drukhari. Even Harlequins, guided by Kegarak's secretive approval, lent their masks to the cause, weaving performances that foretold Ynnead's triumph. For the first time since the fall, Aeldari who had once despised one another found themselves fighting side by side. The Ynnari promised unity, and unity was a weapon sharper than any blade. Their actions shook the galaxy. Yvain and her followers played a pivotal role in the resurrection of Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, during the Terran Crusade. Though an alien, she aided humanity's greatest hope, for she saw in Guilliman a chance to stabilise the galaxy long enough for Ynnead's purpose to unfold. In return, Guilliman tolerated her presence, acknowledging that without the Ynnari, his rebirth might never have succeeded. For the first time in millennia, the fates of mankind and Eldar intertwined not in war, but in reluctant alliance. Yet Ynnari's rise did not resolve the doom of the Aeldari. Instead, it fractured their people further. Some Craftworlds embraced Yvain wholeheartedly, sending war hosts to join her cause. Others denounced her as a heretic, fearing she courted disaster. Commorragh descended into near civil war, with archons tearing at one another over the Ynnari question, and through it all, Slaanesh stirred, its hunger unquenched, watching the birth pangs of this new god with hatred, and perhaps fear. Still, for the Aeldari, the rise of Ynnari was something more than survival. It was hope. Not the cold hope of discipline, nor the hollow hope of indulgence, but the living hope that their race might one day be freed from the curse that had haunted them since the fall. Whether Ynnead would truly rise, whether it would be their salvation or their destruction, none could yet say. But for the first time in 10,000 years, the Aeldari had a vision of a future not bound in chains of despair. The dawn of the Ynnari was a turning point, a gamble with the highest of stakes. In Yvain's hands rested the possibility of a new pantheon, a rebirth for people thought forever in decline. To follow her was to embrace death as a weapon, to wield mortality itself against their eternal enemy. For the Aeldari, this was both terrifying and exhilarating, and for the galaxy at large, it was a reminder that even a dying race, fractured and hunted, could still shape the fate of all. The rise of the Ynnari brought not unity, but conflict. For every Craftworld or Cabal that embraced Yvain's message of hope, there were others who saw her as a threat to everything that had kept their people alive since the fall. The most dramatic of these clashes came upon Samhan, the Craftworld of the Wild Riders, a people famed for their jetbike war hosts, their tempestuous culture, and their fierce independence. It was here that Yvain sought to rally more of her kin to Ynnead's cause. It was here too that her enemies struck, in a battle that would blaze across the ruins of ancient shrines and echo through the future of the Aeldari race. Samhan was a Craftworld like no other. Where Ulthwé brooded and Billtown hungered for empire, Samhan dwellers were nomadic at heart, their clans organised into great warrior houses. They took to the stars upon jet bikes and grav tanks, their wild rider clans forming tempestuous war hosts that swept across the void like storms. Proud and independent, they valued freedom above all, and it was to this spirit that Yvain appealed when she arrived at their Craftworld. Her coming was dramatic. The prophet of Ynnead did not slip quietly into Samhan's halls. She arrived amid ceremony, her companions the Vizark and the Incarn radiating an aura of both death and rebirth that both awed and unsettled the council. To the Wild Rider chieftains, she spoke of Ynnead's promise, of the chance to end the curse of Slaanesh, to see their race rise not in chains of fear, but in the freedom of a destiny fulfilled. To some, her words rang true. To others, they smacked of dangerous heresy. It was into this fragile moment that the Drukhari struck. Through hidden webway portals long thought sealed, a raiding force led by the legendary Incubi master Drazar, the Master of Blades, emerged in the heart of Samhan. Their target was clear, Yvain herself. To the Drukhari, the prophet of Ynnead represented a direct existential threat. If the god of the dead rose, the endless cycle of torment that sustained Commorragh would collapse. For Archons and Covens alike, Yvain's death was a necessity. And so, in the midst of her audience, murderers cloaked in darkness appeared, blades gleaming with promises of silence. The battle that erupted was chaos incarnate. The council chamber became a killing ground as Incubi clashed with aspect warriors, their claves slicing through wraithbone pillars while shuriken fire lit the shadows. Yvain's own guards fell in droves, and the prophet herself was forced into retreat, her hand blazing with the necromantic power of Ynnead as she struck down assailants. The Vizark fought at her side, his blades weaving arcs of crimson that cut down foes too swift for mortal eyes to follow. Yet for every incubus slain, another emerged from the shadows. The fighting spilled into the ancient ruins that dotted Samhan's Craftworld, shrines long abandoned, monuments to the war god Cain, and forgotten temples to gods long dead. Here the Wild Riders took to their jet bikes, roaring through corridors and plazas, their weapons blazing as they outflanked the raiders. The speed and ferocity of Samhan's warriors turned the tide, harrying the Drukhari with a fury born of clan pride. But still, Drazar pressed forward, a whirlwind of blaze that carved through warrior and guardian alike, his only focus the prophet of Ynnari. It was then Jane Zar, the Phoenix Lord of the Howling Banshees, entered the fray. Drawn by visions of conflict to come, she arrived as the battle reached its height, her mask unleashing a keening wail that shattered the courage of the Incubi. With impossible grace she struck, her executioner's glaive cutting through Drukhari champions as if they were children. Her intervention bought Yvain the moment she needed to escape. For all his skill, even Drazar could not stand against the fury of a Phoenix Lord and the combined war hosts of the Samhan. The battle did not end in a clean victory. Samhan's halls ran red with blood, entire clans were broken, their riders slain in the defence of Yvain. The Drukhari withdrew through the webway, dragging captives and corpses to feed their twisted needs. Drukhari himself vanished into the shadows, leaving only rumours of whether he'd been slain or had escaped once more. The Ynnari survived, but at terrible cost. For Yvain, the raid was a turning point. It proved beyond doubt that her enemies feared her enough to strike at the heart of a craftworld. It also proved that her cause was worth blood. Those who doubted her saw the ferocity of which the Drukhari sought her death, and many turned to her side, convinced that only through Ynnead could such hatred be justified. The clans of Samehan, though divided, swore new oaths to her banner. In fire and blood, the prophet of the dead had woven fresh disciples. For the Drukhari, the raid was both a failure and a warning. Yvain had not been slain, but her movement had grown stronger. Whispers of her miracle spread even in Commorragh, stirring discontent among the lowborn and fear among the high. Vect himself, ever the master of the Dark City, began to weave plots to ensure the Ynnari never grew strong enough to unseat his dominion. The raid on Samehan was not merely a battle, it was a clash of futures. On one side, the Drukhari, desperate to preserve their cruel immortality. On the other, the Ynnari, daring to dream of a god who could end the thirst forever. In the ruins of the Craftworld shrines, amid the ashes of the fallen, the Aeldari's fate was written not in prophecy but in blood. Survival would not come without struggle, and the path to salvation would be paved with sacrifice. The tale of the Aeldari is not simply a story of rise and fall. It is the saga of a people who once ruled the galaxy, who shattered themselves in a moment of indulgence, and who have endured 10,000 years of sorrow ever since. Yet even in their decline, they remain a race of paradox, ancient yet fragile, dying yet unyielding, diminished yet still able to shape the fate of the galaxy. Their legacy is not written only in the ruins of what was lost, but in the persistence of what remains. In the aftermath of the fall, survival defined every fragment of the Aeldari. The Craftworlds, adrift upon the void, became sanctuaries where discipline replaced indulgence, the paths restraining passions that once doomed them. The Exodites, far from the core, clung to austere lives on their maiden worlds, enduring hardships as purification. The Drukhari, in the shadows of Commorragh, chose cruelty as sustenance, their survival dependent on suffering. The Corsairs embraced freedom, becoming outcasts who lived and died by their own restless whims. And now the Ynnari carry a radical vision of unity and rebirth, proclaiming that salvation would come not through fear or cruelty, but through the awakening of a god of the dead. Every one of these paths carries the weight of tragedy. For the Craftworlds, the burden is discipline without end, and narrowing of the soul to prevent collapse. For the Exodites, it is toil and sacrifice, their lives hard and their numbers few. For the Drukhari, it is endless hunger, a cycle of torment that ensures survival at the cost of their souls. For the Corsairs, it is exile and instability, the danger of becoming lost in the very freedom they prize. And for the Ynnari, it is uncertainty, for though Ynnead stirs, no prophecy can guarantee that his birth will save them rather than doom them. And yet, the Aeldaris endure. For all their divisions, their dwindling numbers, and the eternal shadow of Slaanesh, they remain among the most powerful peoples in the 41st and now 42nd millennium. Craftworld war hosts still descend upon battlefields, their aspect warriors fighting with a precision and artistry that few can match. Wraith constructs, filled with the souls of their dead, stride into battle as silent guardians of a race refusing to fade. Farseers still weave the threads of fate, guiding their people through skeins of probability too complex for others to perceive. In Commorragh, the Drukhari remain a terror to the galaxy. Their raids strike fear into imperial worlds, their cruelty unmatched, their mastery of the webway ensuring that no place is beyond their reach. Archons like Vect continue to scheme, witch cults continue to perform their bloody spectacles, and the homunculi continue to twist flesh into horrors. They are damned, yet immortal in their defiance, a people who refuse to submit even to the thirst of a god. The Ynnari march at the centre of prophecy. Yvain, the Vizarch, and the Incarn stride across the galaxy, rallying those who believe the Aeldari can be reborn. Already they have intervened in battles that have changed the course of history, aiding in the resurrection of Rabuti Gilliman and standing at the centre of conflicts that could decide the fate of their people. Their movement remains fragile, yet it represents something the Aeldari have not possessed since before the fall: hope. What then is the legacy of the Aeldari? Is it the memory of the Empire, a golden age lost forever to arrogance? Is it the warning that no civilization, no matter how perfect, is immune to collapse from within? Is it tragedy, the endless decline of people haunted by their own sins? Or is it something more, Perhaps their legacy is resilience. For though their empire is gone, though their gods are dead or broken, though their every soul is hunted, the Aeldari refuse to vanish. They fight on, against impossible odds, against themselves, against the galaxy. Every craftworld that sails on, every Exodite who tills the soil, every Drukhari who survives another day, every Corsair who defies the stars, and every Ynnari who whispers of rebirth. Together they are proof that even in ruin, survival is possible. The galaxy of the 42nd millennium is one of darkness and despair. The Imperium staggers, beset on all sides. Orcs, Tyranids, Necrons, and Chaos all vie for dominance. And yet, amid this storm, the Aeldari endure. Fewer in number, fractured in spirit, they are nevertheless present wherever the galaxy trembles. Their seers still whisper warnings into the ears of humanity's leaders. Their warriors still descend from the skies to turn the tide of battles. Their raiders still haunt the shadows of the webway. Their prophets still declare that a god of the dead is coming. The Aeldari are a dying race, but they are not dead yet. Their legacy is unfinished, their fate unwritten. They stand as both tragedy and possibility, reminders of what has been lost and harbingers of what may yet come. Will Ynnead rise and slay Slaanesh, delivering the Aeldari from their curse? Will the Craftworlds hold on long enough to see the rebirth? Will the Drukhari's cruelty consume them, or will even they find salvation in the god of the dead? No one can yet say. What can be said is this: the story of the Aeldari is not over. Their empire has fallen, their numbers have dwindled, their gods are gone, but their will endures. And as long as even one Craftworld sails, one raider strikes, one Exodite tends the soil, one Corsair flies the stars, or one prophet whispers Ynnead's name, the Aeldari live on. Their legacy is not merely one of loss, it is one of defiance. You have received the transmission of Dominissimo Voxlore. The saga of the Aeldari endures, written in grief, bound in survival, and carried ever onward by those who refuse extinction. Mark your allegiance, strike the seal of subscription, and join the ranks of those who seek the hidden truths of the 41st millennium. Until the next broadcast, walk carefully upon your chosen path, for the galaxy offers no mercy, only the strength we forge against the darkness. This is Dominissimo, and this channel carries the lore of the Aeldari.